Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 14th meeting of our 44th season. We do not have 10 Lords of Leaping tonight, but you are privileged to meet our second Lord in succession, after Simon MacDonald. They're both crossbenchers, by the way, and I have a personal preference for crossbenchers. We can talk about that later. But the two other things that I would mention are that both Simon and Lord Adair Turner were really supportive during the dreadful COVID period. Both appeared early on in our World Affairs digital series, and so this is my first chance to welcome Adair Turner and to thank him for his support during that time. And there will be more Lords of Leaping later on in the season, as you know from the programme. Now, Lord Adair Turner is a polymath. If you just look at his career, you've been able to see it. It's been on our website for, 6 to 9 months. And as you can see, he's had major roles in the financial sector. He's been Director General of the CBI. He is on countless other organizations. And the reason he's here tonight, as you know, is because of his strong commitment in this area of sustainability as the chair of the Energy Transitions Commission. And I will leave him to discuss that activity to the extent that he wishes to do so. But I do know that you can welcome him with a very thoughtful and deep discussion about everything to do with energy and sustainability. Please welcome Lord Adair Turner.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Bill, for that introduction, and also that amazingly fulsome CV, which was up there earlier. I learned all sorts of things about myself that I think I'd forgotten. It is actually a great pleasure to be here this evening for the second time, as you mentioned, to the Keele World Affairs Lecture, but for the first time in person. So it's a particular pleasure to be in person, and also to actually be in this part of the world, because my accent does not give it away, and I don't know this area well, but this is where my father came from. He was a Stoke-on-Trent boy. He went to Hanley High School in the 1930s, and he actually taught at Hanley High School in the 1940s for a few years just after the war. So it's a bit of a sort of homecoming to get on the train from London and come up to Stoke-on-Trent. In 2020, I entitled my lecture Technological Optimism, Behavior Change, and Planetary Boundaries. And what I addressed at that time was the question whether, in order to limit harmful climate change, whether we had to all live more frugal lives, not fly, not eat red meat, and limit our consumption, or whether technology would provide the answer for us to be continuing to enjoy as much energy as we wanted and flying as we wanted. And I called that my sort of Greta versus Bill analysis. Was Greta Thunberg right, or was Bill Gates right? Broadly speaking, though with an important reservation related to food and land use, because I do think red meat is a bit of a problem, I came down on the technologically optimistic side. That actually we have the technologies to deal with climate change while continuing to deliver growth in prosperity across the world. But I also said that while technological progress was almost certain in itself to deliver a zero-carbon economy at a very low cost over the long term, I feared that we would not get to that endpoint fast enough to avoid severely harmful global warming. And this evening, I'd like to return to that theme and to consider the danger that while available technology makes it possible to build a zero-carbon economy fast enough to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, which is the target which was agreed at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, that political barriers, not technological barriers, but political barriers, may well prevent us achieving that. And I'm going to sum up my message for you in 4 issues and 4 summary conclusions up front. First, latest emission and temperature trends. Very, very bad. Second, technological trends and costs far more favorable than I dared hope 15 years ago. Third, humanity's inherent ability to cooperate to achieve long-term objectives, always imperfect and probably becoming more so in the world of politics, which has been changed by social media. Fourth, the immediate political situation, which is a euphemism for Donald Trump, very, very bad. But I will try to end up with some ideas for how we can maximize the chances of success in dealing with climate change in a situation where I think it is just not acceptable to accept that we may fail. First then, trends in emission concentrations and the climate. I think the scientific evidence is absolutely clear. Rising concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, primarily carbon dioxide and methane, inevitably produce rising global temperatures, and over the last 150 years, rapidly rising concentrations have been primarily driven by man-made emissions, with fossil fuel use the most important factor, about 75 to 80%, but red meat production and deforestation also important. Here are the fundamental facts, and I hope this is possible to see at even at those people who've chosen to go right to the back of the upper level of the seating. Over the last million years or so, this shows 800,000, before the industrial era, the level of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, measured as parts per million, varied according to completely natural factors to do with sun cycles between about 180 and 280. And then from about 1850 onwards, it began to go up, and it has now reached 420. And there is no credible explanation for this other than the man-made emissions produced by the burning of fossil fuels, plus the methane from red meat, ruminant animals, plus the deforestation which the expansion of agricultural commodities has produced. And so far, if we focus on the last 50 or so years of this chart, we have not yet reached a peak. Indeed, we haven't even managed so far to produce a reduction in the rate of growth of these concentrations. And as a result, and as predicted by climate models, the product of incredibly fine science with a lot of scientists working on this across the world, global temperatures have risen, and in 2024, for the first time, reached a level of more than 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And that's an important figure because at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, 190 nations of the world agreed that we should try to definitely limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally to plus 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. But we went above it last year. Now, it's true that part of the reason why there was that sudden spike just over the last year is what's called an El Nino effect, a natural variation that we have in the climate. And that means that in 2025, we may see a slight decline. And as a result, we haven't definitively gone above that 1.5 degree barrier on a 10-year rolling average basis, which is the way that it's normally measured. But I have to tell you bluntly, we will, because we have not yet even begun to see a significant reduction in the level of new CO2 and methane emissions. And we will have to see that to slow the growth of atmospheric concentrations and thus the resulting temperature rise. Just by the way, I should have simplified this. That strange phrase, methane GWP20 and methane GWT100, there is a variety of ways that you can try and express methane emissions on a CO2 equivalent basis. And there is a range of reasonable ways to do that in the science, and these are simply two ways of doing it, but either of them show methane emissions going up still as well as CO2. At the COP26, and for those who don't know this, there's a thing in climate change science called the Conference of the Parties, the COP, and there are one of these held every year. At the COP26, which was held in Glasgow, and again at the COP30 in Dubai, there was a very strong focus on limiting global warming to 1.5, but we have to be honest, we're not going to achieve that. My own judgment is that the best we can now achieve might be to limit the temperature increase to, say, 1.7 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But in the latest World Economic Outlook, the International Energy Agency, which is one of the most respected global analysts of this challenge, believe that on the basis of the current policies across the world, not the sort of vague pledges we've made, but the actual policies in place, who's got what carbon taxes, who's got what plans to subsidize EVs, how fast are people actually moving away from gas boilers to heat pumps. The actual policies at the moment, they say, will end up with plus 2.4 degrees centigrade warming, and that estimate was before the election of Donald Trump. Now, warning of 1.5 degrees centigrade has already produced this in summer 2023. Wildfires, droughts, floods. This in summer 2024. Wildfires, droughts, floods. And this, in just the last 6 months, an extraordinary flood in Valencia in eastern Spain, completely inexplicable without the impact of climate change and the Los Angeles wildfires. We are in danger of really doing something dramatically bad to the climate of the world with terrible effects on human welfare. All of which could make us all a little bit depressed. But whenever I am in danger of being depressed about these prospects, my antidote, the thing that gets me up in the morning, is the good news that over the last 15 to 20 years, clean technologies that can help us fix this problem have progressed and come down in cost far, far faster than I dared hope when I became the first chair of the UK's Climate Change Committee in 2008. This chart shows on what is called a log normal chart, and I suddenly realized this may be a bit technical, though there's probably quite a lot of people here can still remember from their school days how logarithms work. It basically means along the right-hand side, along the horizontal axis, it shows each step of a 10 times increase in the cumulative capacity of solar panels that we have installed. And on the left-hand axis, the vertical axis, it shows the dollars of a solar PV panel. All you have to take out of this is that there's a mathematical law at work here, which is the more solar panels we build, the more the price comes down, and that over the last 50 years, the price of solar panels has not come down 90%, it's not come down 99%, it's come down 99.9%. The cost of a solar panel that you can put on your roof is 1/1000th of what the price was just 50 years ago. And they will come down another 50% in the next 5 years. Indeed, as I make that projection, the only fear I have is that yet again, I'm going to be too pessimistic. I was, as it said on that chart earlier, the first chair of the UK Climate Change Committee in 2008. And in that committee, when we started work in 2008, we were very proud of our analytical skills, our fact-based approach. We looked at technological studies of what would happen to solar photovoltaics. And we produced an estimate. We were very proud of this estimate that the cost of solar PV might, in the next 15 years, come down by 25%. We were completely useless. The answer was 90%. I hope somebody's destroyed all copies of that analysis and it's not in the public domain because it's so embarrassing. But we were not alone in our failure to anticipate spectacular technological progress. This chart shows, in the blue lines, a series of forecasts by the International Energy Agency as to what will happen to the amount of solar photovoltaics installed in the world. The red shows you what actually occurred. And what you can see is that in 2015, they said, oh, there's been an increase, but it will only go up slowly from now on. And then in 2016, it said, oh, there's been an increase, but it'll only go slowly up from now on. And yet the actuals kept on hugely exceeding what the IEA analyzed. Lithium-ion batteries have also seen a dramatic cost reduction. On the left-hand side, you see the cost in dollars per kilowatt hour that you can store, going from about $1,300 in 2010 to about $120 in 2020, a fall of more than 90% in the cost of batteries in those 10 years. There was then a slight increase between 2021 and 2022, which reflected temporary bottlenecks in critical mineral supply, things like nickel and cobalt and the lithium in itself. But those bottlenecks were rapidly overcome by the innovative development of new battery chemistries. For instance, 5 years ago, everybody was asking the question, where are we going to get cobalt to put into the batteries we put into our EVs? Most batteries going into EVs only 5 years later have no cobalt in them at all, because clever people observed the shortage of cobalt and went out and innovated new chemistries. Looking forward, reasonable projections suggest a further 50% fall by 2030. Battery energy density, which is how many kilowatt hours of energy you can get into a litre or into a kilogram, that is increasing at about 7% or 8% per annum. Again, if you run your maths, that means that you double that energy density every 10 years, and you multiply it by 4 every 20 years, and then by 8 every 30 years. And that continual progress makes it possible either to have rising vehicle ranges. And just before Christmas in China, I was sitting in a car which has a range of 833 kilometers, only over 500 miles, or it makes it possible for us to have smaller batteries and lower cost. As batteries get cheaper, I will make this projection, the total victory of electric vehicles is just a matter of time. They're going to be cheaper up front, they're going to have ranges over 500 miles, and within 5 or 10 years, nobody is going to want to buy an internal combustion engine, even if they don't give a damn about climate change. In China today, electric vehicles are already selling for less than the equivalent size internal combustion engine vehicle and have running costs which are a half or less. This is the BYD Seagull selling in China for $9,800, i.e. about 7,500 quid. Brand new car, 7,500 quid. In road transport, the future is electric, whether you are worried about climate change or not. Battery technology progress and cost reduction is also the key to decarbonizing, to take the carbon out of power systems in many countries. Until recently, the cost of what's called battery energy storage systems, BESS is sometimes the acronym used, battery energy storage systems, tend to be, for a variety of reasons, rather higher than the cost of the batteries that went into electric vehicles. But we are now seeing a dramatic fall in battery energy storage costs. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which is a major global analyzer of the trends, suggests that there could be a further 35% reduction by 2035. But if you actually look at the costs available today in China, they're already below their forecast for 2035. In most of the world, the cheapest way to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity is now either with wind or with solar PV. And the interesting question for designers of power systems is no longer how to generate electricity, but what to do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And for much of the world, and in particular the low-latitude countries which account for most of global population, and by 2050 and then 2100 will account for a still higher share of global population, by far the largest renewable resource is solar. And the balancing problem is really just about what to do when the sun doesn't shine. What to do when you get to 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening? How do you keep the fans or the lighting or the air conditioners going when the sun has gone down? And the answer is that in those countries, solar plus batteries is going to be revolutionary combination to a far, far greater extent than most people have yet realized. On the 2024 summer solstice, June the 21st, I think the Economist rather cleverly picked that date to focus most of their magazine on saying we are on the dawn of a solar age. And I think we are in the sunny parts of the world. And I think it will be hugely positive for human welfare. Africa's total solar resource, the amount of solar power that it could produce, could, in principle, deliver 50 times as much electricity as everything that the whole world consumes today. Africa's solar resource is essentially limitless. In high-latitude countries like the UK, the balancing challenge is much more complex. Here, our primary renewable resource is going to be wind, and in particular offshore wind, and our biggest balancing problems is unpredictable seasonal variations in supply. It is what the Germans call a Dunkelflaute. Dunkelflaute means a doldrum, and indeed the worst Dunkelflaute is a kalte Dunkelflaute. It's a cold doldrum. It is an anticyclonic condition in the North Sea, which means that for a couple of weeks in winter, even if we built a whole load of wind turbines in the middle of the North Sea, we don't have wind power. And if we've switched over all our residential heating to heat pumps, that's just at the time when we want more electricity. That is our biggest challenge. The answer to that will need to be a much more complicated, complex combination of technologies and business systems than is required in the sunny parts of the world. It will include batteries, pumped hydro storage, compressed air, some nuclear power. I am absolutely not against nuclear power. I think we should definitely keep going the nuclear power stations that we already have, and I think we should build some new ones, even though I am a huge supporter of renewables. There is what is called demand-side flexibility. This is persuading people, if they have an electric vehicle, not to plug it into the grid at precisely the same time that everybody else is plugging it into the grid, but to take advantage of a cheap tariff and to charge it overnight. International interconnections are also important, together with some gas turbine capacity, burning either hydrogen or continuing to burn methane, but with what's called carbon capture and storage. But all of these technologies are available, and they will make possible zero-carbon electricity systems by 2050 with as much as 70 or 80% variable or dependent on variable renewables. And the clean electricity which those systems will deliver will enable us to heat our homes at far lower operating costs than we face today, because what electric heat pumps do is take 1 kilowatt hour of electricity and put 4 kilowatt hours of heat into your home by sucking 3 kilowatt hours out of the ambient external environment. They are essentially air conditioners pointed round the other way. When you put all those technologies together, if we were thinking only about the energy used in our buildings, road transport, and in the many industries whose energy input is primarily electric or low-temperature heat, I think it is absolutely undoubted that we could achieve by 2060 a zero-carbon global economy, delivering services and products to consumers at a lower cost than today's fossil fuel-based system. And at the ETC, we believe that in a zero-carbon global economy, we will get about 60 or 65% of our final energy demand in the form of electricity versus about 22% today. But that still leaves some sectors of the economy which are hard to electrify fully and which we sometimes call the hard-to-abate sectors of the economy. These include heavy industrial sectors where what is going on when you produce steel is not just an input of energy, but actually a chemical reaction in which you suck the oxygen out of a iron ore molecule, and unfortunately at the moment it combines with a carbon molecule coming from coking coal to produce CO2. We have not just an energy input, we actually have a chemical reaction, and we've got to find a new way of doing that chemical reaction. And in shipping and aviation, there is no barrier to using electric motors. Indeed, an electric motor on a plane would be far more efficient than a combustion-based system engine. But right at the moment, if you wanted to get a jumbo jet to fly across the Atlantic, you'd need a 250-ton battery, which is a bit of a disadvantage. And we would have to multiply the energy density, which I referred to earlier, the watt-hours per kilogram, by about 6 times before we were seriously into really long-distance electric flight. So I'll give you a bet. We'll get there by 2070, and I make that bet pretty confident that neither I nor most people in that room are going to be around to settle who's won or lost. Now, so we do have, despite these challenges, however, there are technologies available which could enable us to get to zero carbon emissions by mid-century in every one of these sectors. We do know how to make steel using hydrogen as the reduction agent, not coking coal. We do have the ability to use methanol and ammonia as a shipping fuel. There is a thing called sustainable aviation fuel made with bioresources coming from carbon atoms coming from bio, which works. I mean, we can run planes on it today with 100% sustainable aviation fuels. The problem in these sectors is not the technological possibility, but in these there is what we call a green cost premium. It simply means that with the current technologies, although they are technologically possible, they will mean that a ton of cement will cost more than it otherwise would. The ton of steel made in a zero-carbon fashion will cost more than it otherwise would, and shipping freight costs will go up. So unlike in relation to road transport and buildings, where the consumers of 2050 will gain a direct advantage from living in a zero-carbon economy, we will probably need, in some way, to pay more for steel, plastic, shipping, and aviation. But the crucial insight is that with one exception, and that is aviation, the impact of that green cost premium is very small at the level of consumer expenditure. I sometimes ask people, how much steel did you buy last year? Well, unless one or other of you is a purchasing manager at a manufacturing firm, the likelihood is not in direct tons. But all of us indirectly in the washing machines we buy, or the buildings we buy, or the hospital which the government buys on our behalf, we all use about 300 kilograms of steel a year. Now, that means that if the cost of a ton of steel, in order to make it in a zero-carbon fashion, goes up by, and this is a reasonable estimate of it, maybe £75, the cost to you of having all of that made in a zero-carbon fashion is going to be £25, a relatively small amount. The cost of these things disappears at the consumer level. And this chart, and I hope it's probably a bit difficult to show, but what we show here in the middle column is the possible impact of decarbonisation on the intermediate product cost, the ton of cement, the ton of steel, the bulk shipping rate, often 25%, 100%, and then very small impact, with one exception, which is aviation, on what the consumer has to pay. In total, therefore, the cost of living standards in 2060 of living in a global economy which does not use fossil fuels, or which only uses fossil fuels and adds carbon capture and storage, will result from the balance of two effects. Significantly lower costs for customers in everything to do with building energy use and passenger road transport, but marginally higher costs embedded in the price of products which require the input of cement, steel, plastics, or shipping. Overall, put them together, and I think it's a reasonable estimate that the cost to conventionally measured prosperity of living with a zero-carbon global economy in 2060 will trim less than 0.5% of the standard of living of people living at that time, and quite possibly, with technologically advanced, far less than that, and quite possibly a negative figure. So if we focused only on the issue of technological possibility, I think we could be quite cheerful. I am absolutely certain that if we lived in a world of complete international peace and governed by a benevolent dictator who could impose optimal policies, and it's not that I'm volunteering for that role, I'm just setting this out as a theoretical possibility. If we lived in such a world, I have not the slightest doubt that we could build a zero-carbon global economy by 2060, and that by the time we got there, the cost to consumer prosperity would be so small we wouldn't bother calculating it. But we do not live, and I presume we will never live, in a world of benevolent, rational global government. And in the actual world, run by imperfect human beings, non-technological impediments stand in the way of achieving a zero-emission global economy. There are many, and I have set out more in the text, which you can read afterwards, but for the purposes of today, and just to shorten what I'm going to say, let me set out 3 challenges that we face as we try to get to a zero-carbon economy. The first is that although the costs of building a zero-carbon economy are very small, there is a distributional issue. They vary very significantly between particular households. Here in Britain, people living in houses with plenty of garden space for a heat pump or off-street parking to charge an electric vehicle at domestic electricity prices, I think will gain big and soon from UK's energy transition. But those with space constraints who can't easily put in a heat pump, or have no off-street parking, and so when they have an EV are going to have to go to a public charging point, they are going to face significant costs for a considerable period of time. And across the world, differences in people's cost of finance has a huge impact on the costs and benefits of this energy transition. Richer people with sufficient money in the bank to install a heat pump, or, say, in India, to buy a more efficient air conditioning system, or to buy an EV just out of their own cash, will often enjoy operational cost savings which rapidly outweigh the interest income foregone. But those who can only borrow at high interest rates, maybe on credit cards, they will find those investments uneconomic. So the overall macro picture is one of low costs, but there are a lot of differences distributionally, household to household. Our second problem is geopolitical tension and economic competition, which can impede our ability to gain the benefits of technological progress and cost reduction. I talked earlier about the amazing technological progress and cost reduction which we are seeing, but it is important to realize that all of those key technologies are dominated by one country, which is China. Again, there's a bit of a crowded slide, but I'll just tell you the key point. Red is China here. And what it shows is the market share of a whole load of different key technologies and inputs to those technologies, solar photovoltaics, onshore wind, offshore wind, batteries, EVs, fuel cells for trucks. The red share is the Chinese share, and all the blue is Europe, and the black is North America, and then there's some other Asia-Pacific as well. These technologies are dominated by China. And if we lived in a world of total geopolitical harmony, the fact that Chinese companies will now sell you a solar panel for 9 cents per watt versus a US production cost of 25 cents per watt, or could you offer you small EVs into the European market at less than, say, 15,000 euros, 13,000 quid, we would consider that a cause for celebration in a world at peace and no transition problems. But in the real world we live in today, fears of Chinese domination and of threats to local jobs can result in tariffs and investment restrictions which threaten to slow the pace of our globally, technologically possible energy transition. Third and finally, one of the biggest political barriers to effective action on climate change is the nature of modern politics, and in particular, the impact of the social media revolution. At the Energy Transition Commission, which I chair, our natural language of communication is the sort of lecture which I'm now giving. Logical, fact-based, and I hope convincing to the 400 people here in this room and the several thousand people who may read the online version. But hundreds of millions of people now gain their information about climate change from internet browsing. And tens of millions, at least, gain their information from sites which exist at the intersection between what is called the manosphere, which is a sort of thing that young men inhabit to tell themselves that they are superior to women and that they don't have to put up with all this equality rubbish that has been polluting the world for the last 20 years. Anti-vax groups who believe that vaccinations are a conspiracy of the elite. Wellness influencers, often who have a slightly odd approach to things, far-right politicians, and conspiracy theorists. I really do apologize, this is too small to see, but up here you have a quote from Elon Musk. I'm pro-environment, but I support the farmers. He suddenly decided that UK farmers is one of his big issues. Farming has no material impact on climate change. That is complete certifiable rubbish. He is the richest man in the world, the closest friend now of the most powerful man in the world, and he has hundreds of millions of followers. Jordan Peterson, for those of you who don't live in the manosphere, maybe you don't, maybe not many people here live in the internet manosphere, he is a hugely important influencer over young men. Just a reminder, scientists agree that there is no climate emergency. That is absolutely rubbish. A lot of scientists do agree. But we have all of these statements and these conspiracy theories. Surveys still suggest that a strong majority of people in most countries, including the US, believe rightly that climate change is real, man-made, and that we ought to take action to constrain it. But vocal and organized minorities are often more powerful in politics than the silent majority. I just want to try a test here. How many people here have heard about the climate lockdown plot? Well, you obviously don't go on the internet. There is a plot which has been created by the elite, in particular by George Soros and the World Economic Forum. Whenever you have a conspiracy, always refer to George Soros and the World Economic Forum, who, having observed that carbon emissions went down during the period of COVID lockdowns, want to introduce COVID lockdowns across the whole world. They want to lock you in your home. They want to take away your car to deal with climate change. And millions of people believe that that climate lockdown conspiracy exists and that there are powerful people trying to impose it. Now, all of these problems, of course, are close to inherent. International cooperation is always highly imperfect. Processes of technological change have distributional consequences. But at least until now, we've managed to get some sort of international consensus, embedded in, however imperfect, international agreements supported by most countries, that we do face a common problem and must each contribute to its solution. But the election of Donald Trump is a huge setback to that consensus. Friends of mine in the climate change action group, arena, try to dispel the gloom by saying, oh, Adair, the US is only 15% of global emissions and maybe it'll only last 4 years. Or they say, yes, the US federal government is no longer committed to action on climate change, but there will still be companies and states and cities in the US. And all of that is true. But anyone who believes that it doesn't make a difference when the US president believes that climate change is a liberal hoax created by George Soros and the World Economic Forum, etc., is living in fantasy land. Trump's presidency will seriously set back efforts to limit climate change. The US will not now deliver the 48 to 52% reduction in emissions below 2030 level, by 2030, below the 2005 levels to which the Biden administration had committed it. The US will not now provide any financial support to poorer countries to adapt to the impact of climate change, which we in the richer countries have played the main role in producing. Indeed, you may have seen from the reports from Washington over the last 2 days, they have entirely closed down US foreign aid expenditure in pretty much all categories. And the fact that the US is drawing back from this Paris process may encourage other countries to do the same. We have already seen Argentina pulling out of the World Health Organization, copying Trump. At the beginning of last year, I thought that with further progress on national policies and international cooperation, we might just still be able to limit global warming to plus 1.7 degrees, and that a limit of less than 2 degrees was still likely. But the election of Donald Trump alone makes me increase my sort of gut feel of what is attainable to something like 1.9 degrees centigrade, and with a greatly increased chance of really catastrophic effects, and they will be catastrophic effects, which would result from warming of 2.5 degrees centigrade. Now, to get a little bit more scientific than my gut feel, we need to look for, this chart. We need to look at estimates of the remaining carbon budget, which is the cumulative amount of CO2 which scientists believe we could emit and still leave us with a 50% chance of limiting global warming either to 1.5 degrees or 1.7 or 2. In 2020, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the coordinating body of all global scientists, suggested that the budget, the remaining amount that we could emit for a 50% chance of a 1.5 degree limit, was 500 gigatons. But since then, we've had 5 years of emissions at about just over 40 gigatons per annum, so that takes it down to about 290, 295 gigatons, and latest scientific analysis suggests that it's a still lower budget of 160. The equivalent figure for a 50% chance of a 2 degree centigrade limit would be 105 gigatons, and the 1.75 would be roughly in the middle, about 600 gigatons. 600 gigatons at the current rate of annual emissions would be exceeded within 15 years. So we are going to have to start rapid global emission reductions soon to have any chance of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. And we have to do that in a world where the US federal government is no longer committed to achieving this, but instead committed to drill, baby, drill for new oil and gas supplies. So, given the technology potential and the political barriers, how do we still maximize the possibility of staying below, and ideally significantly below, 2 degrees centigrade? Let me end by suggesting 3. There are 5 in the text, and there may be some that you want to ask me about in questions, but for now, just 3. First, we need to win the argument that climate change is a huge problem, which may seem a very odd thing to say, because of course we have to win that argument. But in the years following the Paris COP21 conference, there was a tendency for some people to shy away from the fundamental case for reducing emissions, which is that if we don't do it, we're going to have catastrophic climate change, and to suggest instead that the economic case for green growth was so good that you'd do it even if we didn't have a climate change problem. And they tended to suggest that companies and financial institutions should set net zero targets in their own self-interest, because otherwise they were going to be left with what are called stranded assets. They'd be oil companies that ended up with oil that they couldn't sell, and that would harm shareholder value. But we have to return to the fundamental economics here. Economists have this concept of an externality, a situation where there is a difference between the economics as they look to us all collectively and the private self-interest. And when we have an externality, private incentives alone will never solve it. You need public policies, carbon prices, initial technology subsidies, and regulation. Otherwise, the private sector will not invest fast enough in the zero-carbon technologies which are now available. We have to make the connection between these weather events and the need to invest in a zero-carbon economy as fast as possible. Second, where there are costs to achieving the transition, we need to recognize them in advance and actively manage the distributional consequences. In 2018, President Macron's government in France introduced very significant increases in petrol and diesel taxes, justifying them in part as a means to encourage transition towards more efficient internal combustion engines and then onto electric vehicles. But they did that increase before there were EVs available at costs which ordinary people could afford and with ranges sufficient to meet the requirements of rural and small town dwellers rather than city dwellers. And the economic impact of those increases in duties for those who still did have ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, was much higher for people living in the countryside and small towns who have longer trips to work and shopping than in Paris. And the result was what is called the Gilets jaunes, you may remember them, the yellow vest protesters in France, which was one of the first examples in Europe of a populist opposition movement focusing not on immigration, nor on austerity, but on climate change-related policies. We need to recognize that in an era, we have to be smarter than this in future, and we need to recognize that in an era of increased inequality in both income and wealth, it will be very difficult to persuade people in the bottom half of the income distribution, even in rich countries, to accept any significant cost penalty to achieve zero emissions. So the burden has to be placed primarily on the better off, and we need to work out how to do that. Third, and crucially, we need to ensure as much international cooperation and momentum as possible within this COP process, even within the US no longer there, and within that multilateral context, develop a collaborative, constructive, but also, where necessary, robustly honest relationship with China. You hear two stories about China and climate change. One, that it is the biggest polluter in the world, now emitting about 12 gigatons of CO2 out of a global total of 40 gigatons, with per capita emissions, which are now higher than the UK, still building some new coal-powered plants, and only committed to peaking its emissions by 2030. The other story is that China is the major driver of clean technologies, deploying solar and wind as fast as the rest of the world put together, far ahead of the world in the electrification of surface transport and industry, and able to supply the world with solar panels, batteries, and EVs at prices which can enable rapid energy transition across the world at low cost. Both stories are true. And our relationship with China, and I personally put a lot of time into this, I go regularly to China, I interact with senior Chinese policymakers, must combine these following two aspects. First, being clear that China must accept the responsibility which comes with greatly increased prosperity and emissions. It cannot go on in international climate negotiations pretending that it has the status of a developing nation like Africa or India. It must be a contributor to global climate finance quite as much as the developed world, and we need it to set more ambitious emission reduction targets than it has so far. But conversely, I think we should openly applaud the Chinese for their extraordinarily positive contribution to the development of clean technology, which, contrary to myth, does not now primarily reflect lower environmental standards or bad labor standards, but brilliant entrepreneurship, technological leadership, economies of scale, and learning curve effects. Which means that if we want affordable EVs in Europe for the mass market soon, we cannot and should not exclude imported Chinese vehicles. And if we want to build domestic supply chains in Europe, in wind turbines, batteries, and low-cost EVs, we should combine any tariff protection with a welcome to brilliant Chinese companies to invest here, creating employment and value added here, and helping us via the technology transfer which comes with inward investment to become also ourselves a driver of clean technology development. So 3 priorities at least, none easy, and all requiring political imagination and leadership to deliver. But the good news to which I return in conclusion is that the technology trends are in our favour, and to a far, far greater extent than I anticipated when I was the first chair of the UK Climate Change Committee in 2008. This technological development is so rapid, and the fundamental advantages of electrification as a technology are so great that even with highly imperfect policies, we will probably get close to a net zero carbon economy sometime in the late 21st century, and we will therefore, I think almost certainly, avoid utterly catastrophic levels of climate change above 3 degrees centigrade, which were still on the cards before the Paris process helped unleash some of this change back in 2015. And I have not the slightest doubt that with strong policies and reasonable international cooperation, we could still achieve that zero carbon global economy by 2060, as I say, at a minimum or even negative cost to living standards. And if we did that, we could still limit global warming to perhaps plus 1.7 degrees centigrade and avoid the extremely severe harm to human welfare which will otherwise result. So however difficult the politics, I think we have to achieve that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. You've inundated us with questions, which is hardly surprising after such an outstanding talk. Let's start off with Catherine Escott. Do you think the government should pay for solar panels, especially now we have power cuts?
Sorry, what is the question?
Well, Catherine Escott wants to know whether the government should be paying for these very inexpensive solar panels that you've mentioned.
Should the government pay for them?
Yes. Should it be from general taxation?
Good, good. Well, I'll answer that. Let me first of all say I am just incredibly impressed by this question process. I give lots and lots of talks in lots and lots of different environments, and none of them has ever done this systematic way of trying to get good questions. Usually a group of people randomly stand up with some bee in their bonnet or about some very particular issue and give a speech which is not actually a question, and then end with sort of, don't you agree?
I hope you'll be saying this in 40 minutes'
good.
time.
Okay. So, should the government be paying us to do solar panels? Look, you know, the government is us, right? The government doesn't have any money except the money that we pay to it as taxes. So, you know, should everybody in general be paying for solar panels rather than individuals? The answer is broadly, I would say, no. I think it was right for the government initially to subsidize solar panels and to subsidize it, but realize that was a subsidy that other people paid for. I mean, the way we paid for it originally was by what was called a feed-in tariff. You put a solar panel on your roof and you got a high rate of, you sold some electricity to the grid, and you got, initially, I think people got 40p a kilowatt hour 20 years ago for the first generation of people who had solar panels. But that wasn't costless. That wasn't a government giving it away for fun. I mean, the rest of us were paying for that because that added to everybody else's electricity bill in an indirect fashion. I think it was the right thing to do, because what we often have with these new technologies, like solar PV, which I showed collapsing down in price, they are high in cost, and the only way to make them low cost is to get the industry going. Get the industry going to what's called economies of scale and learning curve effects, learning by doing in the manufacturing process. And we've done that effectively with subsidies for electric vehicles and with subsidies for solar PV. But there comes a time where you have to say, no, I'm not going to do that subsidy any longer, because they're now cheap enough that they can stand on their own. And I think that solar PV in the UK now does broadly stand on its own. I think it's a sensible investment. And I think out of, the always constrained amount that the government can spend on, it's always a choice between one thing or another. I would rather now that they are subsidizing heat pumps than subsidizing solar PV, because I think heat pumps is still a technology at an earlier stage of development in the UK, which needs that help to get it going. Not so much in terms of the equipment, but in terms of the supply chain. I have, in addition to my house in London, I have a cottage in Hampshire, and I put in a solar PV there 2 years ago, very successful, like it a lot. But after I accepted the bid from the local builder, his estimate, it took me 15 months because before he could install it, because he'd got a queue. We don't have enough a supply chain of heat pumps, of people, running businesses with the plumbers, the electricians, to do it. And to get that going, we need, a subsidy to start with. So broadly speaking, if we have available subsidy money, we should focus it on the early stages of technology to get the technology going in order to then get to the stage where you take the subsidy away from that and switch it to the next technology that you need to develop.
Thank you so much. We've got a lot of questions here. We're going to, So I'm going to ask you to focus briefly on a couple here, and they're back to back, I think. You may disagree. So Paul Scott, how do you counter the argument, it's going to cost me so much, but my sacrifice will have such a minimal impact globally? While Jenny Hartley says, how should the wealthy, and you mentioned this, how should the wealthier members of society be taxed to ensure that the burden of necessary change doesn't fall on these, the most heavily on the poor? And how do we sell that idea to the rich?
Yeah. With
difficulty, I presume. So,
okay, let me take both those questions. Look, the first question is what is called, in theory, the collective action problem. We have many challenges in society where our own individual contribution seems so small that it's not worth doing, and where we have to say, well, I'll do it if you do it. And that works quite well at the local level, the 200 people in your street, the million people in the city. And the bigger the unit, the more difficult it is for human societies to achieve that sort of, I'll do it if you'll do it, we're all in this together mode. And look, this is why we may fail. I mean, honestly, this is a very difficult thing to do to get that degree of agreement. I mean, I think of it, I pick up litter. I don't want my streets to be littered. My individual piece of litter, you wouldn't even notice. But I pick up litter because I want to act in a way so that if everybody else acts in the same way, we all enjoy the benefit of streets that are not littered. But how do we persuade people of that? I think we've got to persuade people. It's the point I made at the beginning of my three things. We've got to win the fundamental argument that climate change out there and is going to do major harm. It's going to do harm even in this country. They're going to have floods on a level we've never seen before. And we've got to convince people that it could harm the welfare of their own children and grandchildren. I'm going to become a grandfather for the first time in the beginning of April. My daughter, one of my daughters, having my first grandchild, and I think about, a child born in 2025, if they're reasonably lucky, is going to be alive till 2110 or well into, clearly into the 22nd century. I think we need to make people think about what is the world you are giving to your grandchildren. And we've got to also try and have some moral sense of a concern for other people at the other end of the world. I do actually care if climate change is so bad in northern India that it produces, heat waves where thousands of people just die from heat. But we do have to win that argument. I mean, let me be clear, if we don't accept that argument, if you don't accept that argument, we will not solve this problem fast enough to avoid very high levels of climate change. We'll still eventually get very close to a zero carbon economy because these technologies are so superior that they'll eventually win. But that's the moral argument we somehow have to try and win. I said, we've got to accept that in a society which I think, since I became an adult, has become significantly more unequal in both income and wealth, and to be blunt, I'm one of the people who've done fortunately well in that increase in inequality, but I still regret the increase in inequality which has occurred. I think we've got to be very careful of saying to lower income people, you've got to buy a heat pump even if it's expensive for you, or you've got to buy an electric car until we can provide cheap electric cars. And I think conversely, one does have to convince, better off people, people in the middle and slightly above level of income, and really well-to-do people towards the top of the income distribution, and the seriously rich, that the level of contribution has to vary with that. Now, what does that mean I would do? And I do worry that our government isn't bold enough on some of this. I would immediately introduce a tax on any private jet large enough to be the difference between conventional jet fuel made out of oil and sustainable aviation fuel. I'd make it larger than that so that no logical person would ever fly a private jet into or out of the UK without buying sustainable aviation fuel. Because what that would do would create an early market for sustainable aviation fuel that then helps the entrepreneurs who are setting up those businesses develop the technology to bring the cost down for everybody else. I would increase the tax on business class seats and first class seats in aviation without increasing it for economy class seats, because I think flying on holiday is something that people ought to be able to enjoy at a reasonable cost. But I would take our air passenger duty and I'd turn it into a carbon tax. I think this is a staring in our face opportunity which the government is not doing. At the moment, we charge a significant air passenger duty, but we charge it irrespective of whether the airline is using conventional jet fuel or sustainable jet fuel. I would have a commitment that the standard rate of aircraft passenger duty is going to go up more than inflation, over time, so people know that it's going to go up, but with a very significant discount if the airline fills its tanks with sustainable aviation fuel. I would try in the domestic housing area, and a lot of people say it's difficult to do, but I don't think we thought well enough about this. I think we could think about ways of allowing people a certain amount of gas in their domestic bill, which is at the current price, but then charging a carbon tax on the slice above that, a tax which is only paid by people who are using more than the average amount of gas, who are by definition therefore almost certainly living in a larger home. I think we just got to get creative about this, and one of the huge problems you have in policies across the world, but it's a big problem in the UK, is the Treasury. Basically, if the Environment Minister or the Transport Minister ever suggests ideas like that to HM Treasury and to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, they get a nasty letter from the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury saying this is nothing to do with you, only HM Treasury decides taxation policies. We're just not creative enough about some of the policies that we could use to charge for the carbon that we use, but with it focused on the higher income people within society.
In a while, I'm going to come on to lots of different technologies that people are asking about. I'm not sure we'll have time to really go into the detail that you're able to do, but I will try to sum them up. I'm going to turn now to farming. Several questions about that. So Chris Nibbs, to get to carbon neutrality, the gas that causes, he says, 30 to 50% of the temperature rise is methane, and he says that 40% of that comes from decaying matter in wetlands, so he wonders whether there really is a technological solution to that. Lisetta says, should we persuade farmers to grow vegetables instead of cattle and sheep, and does that mean subsidies? And David Hudson, can agriculture really adapt better to improve carbon sequestration? If you wouldn't mind trying to give just a quick overview, your feelings on farming, if you can't go into the detail.
Well, let me start with methane. We often don't talk enough about methane. Methane, by the way, for those who don't know, is the same as natural gas. The gas that you're burning in a gas boiler is methane, CH4, one carbon atom, 4 hydrogen atoms. A lot of the focus is always about CO2, but something like 35% of all the global warming effect that we've seen so far is coming from methane. And although we're beginning, and you may have seen it on the chart, to look like we're capping out the CO2 emissions, the methane emissions are still going up. The methane emissions come from the following mix of things. I'll try and get the figures roughly right. If I think I remember right, it's sort of 250 million tons or so. And out of that, order of magnitude, 90 or 100 is actually produced in producing fossil fuels. It is methane that leaks from gas fields and never gets delivered to the end consumer and therefore never gets turned into CO2. And that's a big problem because when it goes up as methane unburnt rather than CO2 after it's burnt, that is a much more powerful greenhouse gas. Old coal fields produce methane. Methane results from leaks within the system. It results in gas processing, etc. One of the things we need oil and gas companies to do is absolutely commit to a set of engineering fixes which at least get rid of all that problems. And actually that engineering is available, and what is called the methane emissions from the actual activities of the oil and gas companies itself has the equivalent effect of about 4 gigatons of CO2. So the big problem with fossil fuels is burning them, 35 gigatons of CO2, but 4 gigatons or so is just the stuff which is in the methane they're producing, plus some CO2 leakages, etc. So, but apart from that, the other big sources of methane, there are sort of natural processes, there are things to do with wetlands or sometimes not wetlands. Badly managed peat bogs, etc., can produce them. Decaying rice can produce them. And then there is methane emissions from ruminant animals. Any animal with a double stomach, whether it be a cow or a sheep or a deer, will produce methane. And that methane emission is quite significant in terms of global warming. Agriculture also produces CO2 emissions through deforestation. Deforestation across the world, which then, the trees are burnt down, and the CO2 goes up when they're burnt down, but also CO2 is released from the soil when you no longer have tropical forest there. That's about 5 gigatons a year. Overall, agriculture across the world certainly responsible for 20% of global warming, and some would say for 30% or so. So we need to take agriculture and its land use effects, its management of waste, the ruminant emissions from cattle and sheep, really seriously. And it's a difficult area because there aren't easy technological fixes, right? I can tell you how to run the global shipping fleet on methanol without producing, with no net emissions. I could shift, global steel. If we were told tomorrow that some benevolent deity, that she had sent angels in the night to steal all of our coking coal, or we knew that she was going to do it in 5 years' time, We could produce steel in 5 years' time using hydrogen as a reduction agent. We have the technological solution available. The problem with agriculture is we don't have easy technological solutions available. We are going to have to do a whole variety of things. We should be getting much more serious about nitrogen fertilizers, both because of a greenhouse gas effect through nitrous oxide and also all the local effects by nitrogen runoff. I think we should have a tax on nitrogen fertilizers to encourage farmers to use it more sparingly. I hope I'm going to get out of the room if there are lots of farmers having said that. But if we have carbon taxes, because we think that people, steel mills producing CO2 should pay carbon taxes, logically farmers using nitrogen fertilizers should pay nitrogen taxes. On meat, I think we are going to have to eat less red meat, both because of the methane emissions it produces and because of the deforestation effect, which is produced in Brazil in particular by the production, by either cattle raising or by the production of feed for cattle, in particular in the US, but also to some extent in this country. I personally only eat red meat 4 times a month. I used to love it, but I've decided that I can't stand in front of you and talk about the importance of reducing emissions without making a decision on that myself. When you eat it 4 times a month, you eat the very best because you concentrate on, the best organic, grass-fed, beautiful meat. I think that is the direction we have to go because unlike in relation to aviation, shipping, steel, I just can't give you a technological fix. There may be synthetic red meats, and I know that a lot of people won't like that idea, but I think you will see that being developed as well.
Let's have a quick go at some of the technologies, and I don't want this to take up too much time because a lot of other really profound questions that you have triggered. So the members are asking you about, for example, hydroelectric. We've got the highest tidal races in the world. Plenty of rain, so what happened to hydroelectricity in the UK? Roger Hartley, I think this is North Sea Oil. Should Rosebank and Jackdaw be approved? Nuclear, what hope for nuclear fusion? I think we should skip that one because that's a highly technical subject. But Adrian says, can modular nuclear solve the problem of long lead times on the reactors that might get built? John Sherwood is on about air fuel. And do we really want
air fuel?
Well, he's saying even though some sustainable air fuel is available, do we really want to encourage its expansion by adding an extra runway such as Heathrow? So you've got a policy issue there. And we've got questions about hydrogen. You've made reference to it. So would you care to share your views on its place in all of this? So, and the other one is tidal.
Is what?
Tidal.
Tidal.
So
right.
I think people are, if you just...
Okay, do you want me to deal with all of these?
No. What I'd like you to do.
Okay, let me go through very quickly.
Say which ones.
Okay, very, very quickly. Nuclear fusion has a great future and always will have.
That's fine.
Though actually, there are some reasons why I think it might come a bit faster than it previously was.
One line for each one would be
right.
Great.
Tidal, I think, will probably not be a big technology. I think the cost of solar and wind has come down so much. I think if you wanted to do estuarial tidal, it would not be a mad thing to build the Severn barrage, which has been talked about. Globally, however, it's not a big part of the story because there are only a few estuarial resources in the world that have a tidal stream quite as strong as the Severn effect. It is one of the bigger tidal ranges in an estuarial situation in the world. There is a small such plant in Brittany, in a place called La Rance, which has been going for about 50 years. But broadly thinking, I think there's a reason why that hasn't developed. Maybe moving on to hydroelectricity. Look, I think we should develop hydroelectricity. The UK doesn't have a huge amount more hydroelectricity potential. It just doesn't have the scale of the mountain dam-based potential of Norway and Sweden. Of course, you could do more in Scotland, and it doesn't have the really big huge rivers that provide huge, what is called run-of-river hydro, as against dammed hydro that you get in Brazil from the Amazon or from the Nile or from the big Russian rivers. So, yes, we should develop hydro. I think the big story for hydro in the UK should be to develop more pumped hydro. Pumped hydro is where you have a dam and you're using it not as really a main source of electricity, you're using it as a store of electricity. And you have your turbines able to work both ways. They can take the water down and turn it into electricity when you need electricity. And then when electricity is in surplus supply on a sunny day in summer when people aren't using many things, or on a really windy overnight time in winter, you pump it up back again. Hydro is a great battery. It's a water battery, and we should be developing more of that. Small modular nuclear, look, on nuclear, I do actually think fusion may get there eventually. It may get there a bit faster than we used to think. People used to say it's 30 years away and always will be. I think we may get there in 20 years now, but I wouldn't bank on it. Large nuclear, wherever you've got large nuclear, I think we should keep it going as long as possible. I do think that the German decision to close down already existing nuclear plants was a completely mad thing to do, and I've said that straight in their face to members of the Green Party, in Germany, with whom I have otherwise perfectly good relations, but not on this. I think it was a crazy thing to do. New nuclear at the moment appears more expensive. We keep on being promised by the nuclear industry that they'll get the cost down, but the costs of our new nuclear commitments, Hinkley Point nuclear is looking very expensive relative to the latest costs of offshore wind. But I would still do 15 or 20% of our electricity from nuclear, because one of the key rules of an electricity system is diversity is good, right? You want a mix, because then you'll have something running at any time. So even if it's more expensive, I'd probably do it at 15 or 20%. Somebody mentioned small modular nuclear. So the basic proposition in the nuclear industry now is that we've been disappointed by our ability to bring down the costs of great big nuclear plants like Hinkley Point. These are plants which have about 1.5 gigawatts of capacity in the reactor, and you often put two together, 3 gigawatts of capacity together. Those costs have not come down. Indeed, most of the developments in Europe have seen enormous cost overruns. There was one in Finland, there's one in Flamanville in France, and there's Hinkley Point. These are all coming in, 10 years after they were promised. I have been promised by EDF that I can be there at the point when they put the button on for Hinkley Point. I think I was first promised that in 2019. I think I'm looking forward to perhaps going there in 2029. The cost overruns have been huge. Now, the argument that is put forward is these are very big engineering plants with new designs, new safety features, new regulations, and therefore, whenever you do a first of a kind of anything, it ends up costing far more than you thought. And the trouble is, yes, that's true, but we don't need hundreds of these, so we'll never get to the economies of scale. So what the nuclear industry is doing is, if instead we deliver something which is 100 megawatts, a small modular plant, we'll do more of producing that in the factory, we'll standardize it, and then we'll just churn out 100 of this smaller unit, and we're beginning to get economies of scale. It's not a crazy argument. I think it's an unproven argument, and I think we should put some money into supporting it and seeing if they can deliver. If they can deliver, and deliver small modular nuclear at a competitive cost versus renewables, or even a bit above because of the benefit of the insurance effect, I will be the first to applaud them. I simply don't know at the moment whether we're going to get there. Hydrogen is going to be a big part of the global economy, but less big than we thought 5 years ago. I think it will be part of how we get steel to net zero. I mean, essentially it works like this. You've got iron ore with some iron atoms and some oxygen atoms, and to make iron, you've got to suck the oxygen atom off the iron atom. That's what's called a reduction process, and it's the opposite of rusting, which is what's called an oxidation process. This process at the moment is done by bringing a carbon atom in coke and coal nearby, and it grabs hold of the oxygen atom under some circumstances, takes it away from the iron, leaves you with iron, but with the disadvantage that your carbon atom has combined with some oxygen and turned into CO2. You can do exactly the same with a hydrogen atom, and by definition, you will end up with a hydrogen atom with some oxygen attached, steam, H2O. So it's doable, it's possible, and I think it will play a major role there. There are also, I think we will use hydrogen to produce sustainable aviation fuel. We will produce hydrogen to produce either ammonia or methanol. Where I do not think we will produce hydrogen is in passenger cars. Every time I have to Japan, I have to be polite when I meet people from Toyota. Toyota, sadly, were ahead of the rest of the world 20 years ago in the development of battery technology with the Toyota Prius. And they took an extraordinary, mad detour to say that the world would have passenger cars, hydrogen passenger cars. Right today, in 2024, there were probably 12 million electric vehicles, certainly over 10, 12 million, I think it's roughly right, passenger electric vehicles sold, and no more than 20,000 hydrogen passenger cars sold with huge subsidies. Nobody is going to drive. Passenger hydrogen cars they're just not the future. And what is surprising to me, compared with 6 years ago, is even in electric trucks, even in trucking, they're less than we thought. 6 years ago, I would have probably said that trucking above, say, 10 or 20-ton truck, that's going to be a hydrogen fuel cell truck, not electric. But I can tell you that just 2 years ago, I was with Volvo in Gothenburg in Sweden. They are members of my Energy Transition Commission, and they unleashed me on their test track, driving a 16-meter, 40-ton load. It wasn't actually loaded, it was about 10 tons when it's unloaded, electric truck around their test track. And once you've done that, you think, I've seen the future and it works. I mean, these things work. I think the role of a battery electric is going to go further up the weight range and further along the distance range than we previously thought. There still may be a role for hydrogen trucks in that 40-ton segment, but all the stuff that goes around town, the 10, 20-ton stuff, which does local delivery to from the main warehouse to the actual store, that is going battery electric. And that is a new development of the last 6 years, and it's squeezed some of the role for hydrogen.
Now, I'd like us to skip, if you forgive me, Chairman's prerogative.
Yeah, sorry, that was probably too lengthy.
No, we got...
But it was 6 questions.
I know. There's so many big questions here.
Okay.
We could go do a lot on technology. Let's move to a broader question, and I'll express it through these three members are coming at it from a different angle. Ray Beecham, once the utopian zero net growth, he's being a little bit rude here, once the utopian zero net growth situation is reached, how do we get the CO2 out of the atmosphere to reduce it to acceptable or normal levels? That's sort of, his thought bubble. Dave Martin, am I correct in thinking that even if we achieve net zero, the world will still be too warm? Ice caps will continue to melt, blah, blah, blah. And Fiona Bailey, and she's saying, if on a personal scale we attempt to reduce our carbon emissions by embracing what you described, the new, cheaper Chinese technologies, aren't we actually adding to the emissions and the mineral stripping globally from all these Chinese manufacturing processes? Could you sort of distill
Let me go through
quick answer on that?
I think the idea that China is only able to produce these cheaply because it has lower environmental standards had a truth 15 years ago and is completely untrue now. So China solar PV, yes, it uses electricity, but increasingly the electricity they're using is from solar PV panels. You only have to have a few months of your output from a solar PV manufacturing plant take those panels and put them around you, and you've got enough electricity to drive the next generation of solar PV. Solar PV is not sufficiently energy intensive in its manufacturing process for it to be other than an absolutely thoroughly good thing. What's called the carbon payback, the pace at which the benefit of deploying it outweighs the carbon which went into it, that is very, very rapid. There is a carbon footprint in Chinese batteries and Chinese EVs, and I am very, very supportive, I didn't cover it, but it's in the full text, of what is called carbon taxes and border carbon adjustments. I'm absolutely willing to say that we should apply tariffs related to the carbon intensity of the products. We should say to any batteries which are imported from China, tell me about the carbon intensity of how they were produced, and I'm going to face you with a carbon tariff on that. I can tell you that the Chinese will very, very quickly be running those factories off renewable electricity. That's what these guys are like. I deal with them. I'm a huge admirer of them, but while also telling them bluntly, you know, the things I said earlier about the fact that they've got to have tighter emissions. I think we've got to respect what they've done and realize what they've done. And I draw a complete distinction between a carbon tariff and just a tariff, right? I'm absolutely willing to charge tariffs to say, you are selling me a product which has too much carbon in it. I don't want that. That I think we should have, but simply excluding them even once they are low carbon. So minerals, the crucial thing, we looked at the issue of minerals very, very carefully in a report which we produced at the ETC. It's on our website. It's called Minerals and Material Resources for the Energy Transition. The essential answer is there is no shortage in the world of the minerals that we need. There is no shortage of lithium or cobalt or nickel. One of the ones which is most worrying is the supply of copper, actually, surprisingly. Yes, there are production processes that have bad environmental impacts. For instance, huge expansion of nickel production in Indonesia recently, which has been done in a bad environmental fashion. But the overall environmental footprint and the adverse environmental footprint of all the minerals we will ever need to drive the energy transition is much, much less than the footprint of the fossil fuel-based system. I mean, basically, in order to have a world in which all our electric vehicles come from, all our vehicles are electric, we will need, at the absolute peak, to source about 1 million tons of pure lithium a year. To get 1 million tons of pure lithium a year from a rock base, you'll need about 7 million tons of lithium carbonate, and you'll need to move around, you know, and blow up and shift around in trucks, 70 million or 100 million tons of rock. That is bound to have an environmental impact. But what do you think moving that 70 million tons of rock compares with the fact that today we mine 7,000 million tons of coal a year, and then the next year we have to do the same all over again forever and forever? Because with the lithium and the cobalt and the nickel, we will build up a certain stock, and then we can and we must recycle it. There's absolutely no reason why, with technologies that we already have and with tight regulation, all the nickel and the cobalt and the lithium that gets to an end-of-life battery should be recycled. And the European Union and the UK have very tight regulation on that, but so too has China. China is introducing very strong regulation to force the recycling. So it is a very complex, you know, it's a very detailed issue, but I do assure you that when you look at it in detail, if you want to worry about local environmental inputs, worry about agriculture, right? As a driver of deforestation, agriculture is 100 times bigger impact, or even 1,000 times bigger impact than all the mining in the world. As a user of scarce supplies of water in some parts of the world, agriculture is 1,000 times more important than all the mining activities in the world. We have to have a sense of the relative importance of different things. Yes, we need tight regulation. Yes, we need to foresee the demands. Yes, we need recycling. And yes, I support carbon taxes. But the problems are solvable. The overshoot issue, look, you get these scenarios which say, we're not going to get to net zero, so I'm going to assume that we have what's called a whole load of carbon removals, right? Or we can get to net zero, but too late, and we're going to have carbon removals to then get us back to 1.5 degrees centigrade. I wish we didn't have to plan on using them, but I think we are in a situation where we will use them as well. Again, it's something which in my Energy Transition Commission we did a very careful analysis of what are the ways of removing carbon from the atmosphere. There are what is called natural processes, which is fundamentally reforestation and various forms of doing agriculture in a way that sequesters more carbon in the soil. There's some fantastic things like, re-wetting peatlands, which stop net emissions out of them. And then there's what's called engineered emissions, which is actually using renewable electricity to drive a process called direct air capture and suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and then put it down into geological formations. It's immensely energy intensive because the figure, you'll remember from earlier, is 420 parts per million. Well, 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere is enough to cause horrible climate change, but it's a very small trace that you've got to pump a lot of air through a lot of solvents to get hold of that 420 parts per million. But it can be done at a cost. So yes, we will need these technologies because we didn't start. We will need them partly because we probably can't get all the way to zero in all sectors of the economy without those. And I think we will probably need them to, or should ideally need them to have an overshoot and pull back, because the person who asked this is absolutely right. Once we go to 1.7 to 2, 2.5 degrees, if we leave it for that forever, we will be exposed to a set of gradually reinforcing effects. The melting of the Greenland ice caps, if Donald Trump hasn't already turned it into some Riviera. I mean, he's placing rivers. The particularly worrying one is what's called methane hydrates, the fact that under the permafrost of northern Russia and China, methane is trapped in the permafrost, and if it melts, then that methane will get released. So if it is the case that by the second half of the 21st century, we have sadly warmed by 2 degrees centigrade, we ought to be then trying to say we want net removals so that we actually reduce the temperature back down again. So we do need these, we need to develop these technologies and we need to deploy them. There was a third question in the middle, which I have now forgotten.
Yes, well, I think would you forgive me? Because we have to close at a certain point in time.
Okay, fine.
And you've given a very eloquent...
Sorry, I've squeezed out whoever was one in the middle.
Yeah, don't worry. Okay. They'll forgive you.
Yeah, okay.
Because we've got time for a few more questions. We are going to...
So I'll try and go faster.
Yeah. Well, the questions are complicated. That's the trouble, and I sympathise with you. I couldn't answer them. This one's broadly about profitability and market, and they come in two different ways. It's totally different questions, really. So Julie's wondering, if the new technologies ultimately lead to lower costs for the consumer, which you've been telling us about so profoundly, how are the big companies going to respond and react when they're no longer, as she puts it, milking high energy profits, and how can they justify their huge dividends? So Julie's coming from that angle. Yeah. Alison's saying, and this is different, can Donald Trump in reality impose tariffs on China when China dominates the market share for clean energy technologies, and possibly even the access to the natural resources to create them? So So think of it in terms of
Okay, well, the second
capitalism
question,
and
I'm not sure that logic constrains the action of Mr. Donald Trump.
Okay, that's fine.
The answer is he can impose tariffs on China, particularly if he's not very interested in climate change. I mean, the question is saying he's not going to impose, tariffs on China because China is, the cheapest source of wind turbines in the world. But Donald Trump hates wind turbines. He's introduced a moratorium on offshore wind on the grounds that he wants to protect whales, as in W-H-A-L-E-S. A deep concern for whales has not previously been part of our understanding of Donald Trump's persona. And as best people can work out, he just didn't like offshore wind turbines within the site of his golf course at Turnberry in Scotland. And sadly, we live in a world where enormously important decisions for humanity are being made capriciously by a man who has the sort of power of a medieval king to say, I didn't like that when I was off on my hunting trip, so, I'm going to have a moratorium against it. That's the seriousness of the situation that we're in. But look, if he was concerned about climate change, he would be worried about, where's my access to my cheap solar panels, my cheap turbines, my battery technology, etc. But because he simultaneously doesn't care about climate change, that I don't think is a big constraint on, I don't think he'll be worried about that retaliation within the Chinese capability. I don't think that would be part of his thinking. The first question is a very good question, because broadly speaking, you're absolutely right. And it's not just profit, it's also, by the way, employment. We have to be blunt about this. If electric vehicles are going to cost the consumer less, there'll have to be fewer workers involved in making them. I mean, Karl Marx was ultimately right. I mean, not in everything, but in his labor theory of value, that ultimately, all products have a price which reflects the accumulated slices of labor which went into them. And electric vehicles are going to be cheaper because they're much simpler. They have about 1/10 as many moving parts as internal combustion engines, and therefore the total supply chain is going to be smaller. So it's not just that, the big automotive companies, if they don't win share, will have shrinking profits. But sadly, it is true, and we've got to be honest about this. There will be fewer workers in the automotive industry of the world. Now, there are other jobs we will create, but this is one of the transition things we've got to be aware of. As for the oil and gas companies, it's also true that they have a particular challenge, which is about what their shareholders want. Investors invest in oil and gas companies, particular types of oil and gas companies, almost as a bet. And it's a bet on exploration and production, which sometimes produces nothing and sometimes produces a lot. And that's partly what the shareholders of Exxon and Chevron are used to. Investing in a wind farm is not like that. It is, particularly if you have your power market structure right and you have a system of somewhat fixed prices for the output of those wind farms, it delivers a return which is it's lower, but it's less risky, right? It's more like the return you'd expect for investing in some sort of utility. It's closer to what you'd get for investing in a bond instrument rather than an equity instrument. In the terms of the capital markets, it exists more at the lower risk, low return end rather than the higher risk, higher return end. And that is, for instance, a major problem for oil and gas companies when they say, I'm now going to invest in renewable industry. They're doing something which, their shareholders don't necessarily want because it's not exciting enough. It doesn't have a shoot the lights out possibility, but it's good for humanity, and it's a way of giving us energy without the volatility of energy prices, which we'll always face as long as we are dependent on oil and gas. So the question is a very good one, because there's layers and layers of complexity behind it, but we've got to manage through that.
We've got 2 questions to go, because I think this one you might want to give a short answer. From Brian Rogers: is Ed the right person to lead our net zero drive?
Yes.
Okay. Jeff Elliott has a different question. Is there an exemplar nation that is balancing personal desire for a better or best life with the problems of global climate?
Actually, somebody asked me this in the break, and I've been trying to think about it, but I think the answer is there is no one, because all the ones you point to that are doing some things better, it reflects their natural resource endowment. So Norway will very soon be an almost entirely electrified society. In December 2024, 96% of all passenger cars bought in Norway were electric. This year, it'll be effectively 100%, essentially banning internal combustion engines from this year. But Norway has, relative to its population, limited amounts of hydroelectricity. It has very cheap electricity, and it has no problem of balancing, because hydroelectricity is what we call dispatchable. You can switch it on and off exactly in relation to demand. So, I'm a great admirer of Norway, but they've got it easy, right? Spain is roaring ahead with renewables, but they have far more solar resource than we do. And as I mentioned, if your system is fundamentally solar and you have air conditioning and you need to keep it running into the summer evening, that's an easier problem to balance than when your resource is mainly offshore wind and you're trying to work out how you keep the heat pumps going in the middle of winter. So there are different countries, I think, which I admire with different elements of policy. And, I do spend time in China, and I admire the extraordinary electrification of their transport fleets. It is extraordinary to go to a city like Shenzhen or Shanghai and to realize that all the buses are electric. Every single two-wheeler is electric. The majority of the cars on the road are electric. It's just much nicer. It's much quieter. It's less smellier. It's less, it's just a better environment in which to be. It's a better place to sit on a street-side cafe and enjoy the air. But on the other hand, China is still building coal-fired power stations. So I've been trying to rack my brain as to whether there's anyone who I say, well, that's it. And I think the answer is no, right? You have to say, this country's doing this well, this country's doing this well, this country's doing it quite well, but it had the advantage of these resources. I think that's how I do think about the world, but I'll keep thinking about whether I think somebody whether I come across any country that's doing it all right.
Well, I hope that you'll be coming back to give us your thoughts on that in a few years' time. Firstly, I would say this was one of the most outstanding talks, lectures that we've had in many a day. I thought it was totally electric and totally free of hot air. And I mean that quite sincerely, and the evidence for that is the vast number of questions that you have generated, and which you were all deep and demanding deep explanation. And what has come out to this audience, I'm sure, is your incredible depth of knowledge on all of these issues and a wonderful ability to communicate complex issues to, I was going to say ordinary people, but to citizens of the realm. So it's been a fantastic evening on such a challenging subject, and I can't thank you more for coming to be with us. This was so much better than when we did it in digital, because here you are, connecting with this audience and creating such a great atmosphere on one of the existential challenges of the day. Thank you so much, Lord Adair Turner.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Brian.
Great. Thanks. Good. Thank you. Good. Thank you.